Hello and welcome to another anime lore and theory video. I'm Shergok, your host, and today we are going to take a closer look at how the Kingdom of Re-estize reacted to the mention of Ainz and the declaration of war from the Empire of Barut, and why Gazef, despite being the strongest man in the kingdom and a personal confidant of the king himself, was unable to adequately warn the court and country about the danger that this man posed, and why nobody wanted to heed his warning. But before we're going to take a closer look at any of this, let me quickly thank my Patreons for supporting this channel, as well as say thanks to all users of the YouTube thanks function for making one-time donations. And with that said, let's get to the topic at hand. It was a warm and humid day in the capital of the Kingdom of Re-estize. While a million people labored in the summer heat, preparing for the harvest season, not only did the humidity in the air feel oppressive, but also a wasteful and unfortunate expense of power that have become an unfortunate tradition would await them again this year. Every year, a few weeks from now, the Empire would once again, under a flimsy pretext, provoke a conflict, leading to the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of men, workers desperately needed in the fields at this very time. This would once again result in a poor harvest, simply because much of the work during harvest time would go undone. Even worse, the surplus of fresh rye, barley and wheat, along with fruits like apples and pears, and vegetables like carrots and potatoes, would be immediately used or confiscated as provisions for the army. As a result, there wouldn't be enough to store in the granaries and warehouses for the long and harsh winter ahead. Not only did over 100,000 men need to be fed and maintained in the field, but ensuring the continued supply of these troops would also require more workers, yet more laborers, as well as additional resources to support the lords who would lead these men. What had become a long and grueling obligation for the common people by now, leaving them fearful of the consequences of neglecting their fields, was viewed slightly differently by the nobility that would lead them once again to the field of battle. For the nobility, it had become not just a tedious routine, but like the nightly walk to the kitchen or a maid's chamber, something of a pleasure walk. Sure, no one except one part of the body enjoys getting up in the middle of the night to embark on such an inconvenient journey, but the sweet reward at the end makes all the hardship worth it. For the nobility, this was a prime opportunity to bestow some military prestige and pedigree upon their first and second-born sons. It allowed them to prove that the sons of the houses had led in battle and fought on the field, though without the usual dangers, without the chaos of real combat, and without the risk of true defeat. By now, the annual declaration of war had become routine, the assembly of the armies a parade, and with it came a perfect opportunity to prove oneself on the field without really being tested. For in these annual wars, no one would do actual real fighting. The mobilization of the kingdom and the absenteeism of the labor in the field was the true aim of the Empire of Barut. No need for actual bloodshed. And the only time a serious conflict arose on this field of battle was when the fine cavalry shed their blood at the wall of spears and halberds wielded by the royal army. Even though a peasant with a spear lacking even a hint of metal at its tip posed no real threat to the well-armored and excellently trained elite cavalry of the various noble houses of the empire. It was the sheer, passive mass of countless spears that bled this very cavalry dry, like a horse driven through miles of thorn bushes, eventually succumbing to the countless pinpricks. So did the cavalry of many nobles of the empire lose their lives on what had been the once green but now blood-soaked and unhaunted Cuts plain. From the perspective of the kingdom, this loss hit the empire hard, and under normal circumstances, it would have certainly led to an end of the conflict with the kingdom. However, A few keen-minded enough to recognize what truly happened could see clearly that this loss had served the internal political prestige and power of Gazef, who now could make these noble houses answer for the loss of their troops, ultimately leading to the downfall of these noble houses. It was through this very maneuver that Gazef made these noble houses unable to resist, by making sure that they would lose their personal armies, their personal guards, and that there would be a pretext to just rob them of their power or their life. And so Gazef earned his name, the Fresh Blood Emperor, and cemented his power. His own legions had been spared wisely, and this sparing of lives and his apparent respect for them won him the loyalty of the Knights of Baharut. And while this battle was the exception and not the routine that has now become part of the annual declaration of war, no one could be truly sure that the Empire would not try to break through this time. So if not enough troops were mobilized, the Empire could actually seize a valuable city, the fortress city of Irantel, and thereby gain entrance to the soft and relatively undefended heartland of the kingdom. And therefore every single year, hundreds of thousands set out during the harvest season to fight an army that doesn't actually want to fight, but only seeks to economically weaken the kingdom. And after a few dozen blows and a few men that have died in the field, the Empire would once again retreat. And it was exactly this lethargy and tiresome routine, like the humid warm air, that enveloped the royal palace of Rolente, in the heart of the kingdom of re-estize. In the palace itself, one of the nobles presented this year's absurd demands from the Empire. Once again, a pamphlet had been sent with unreasonable, unachievable justifications and claims, which were meant to legitimize yet another upcoming war against the kingdom. Thus the court heard that the lands which had not only been part of the kingdom for 200 years, the lands around the fortress city of Irantel, which also personally belonged to King Ramposa III, were, according to the Empire's writing, not only not a part of the kingdom of re-estize, but instead it was claimed, to the surprise and amusement of all, that these lands supposedly belonged to a magic caster named Ainz, and that the Empire merely demanded the return of these lands to its rightful owner. Lands on which the most important fortress of the entire kingdom stood, and which protected the way into the kingdom itself. What would have left tacticians and strategists with a heap of new informations and the rather suspicious behavior, a suspicious change from the Empire's perspective. From the perspective of the nobles, presented with the informations of these documents, it was only worthy of a joke. The Empire was apparently scraping the bottom of the barrel, if this is the best justification for yet another tiresome war that they could come up with. What caused the court to briefly and politely laugh stirred an unsettling feeling in Gazef's Dronovs, the kingdom's first warriors and the strongest man in the kingdom's heart. Ainz was the man, the magic caster, who had saved him and his warrior band when they were alerted to an ambush by the theocracy of slain. Gazef had seen the immense magical power Ainz commanded. Not only did he have an undead creature under his control that posed a significant threat to Gazef, but he had also single-handedly teleported the warrior band to safety from what had been a lost battle. And instead of relying on the king's elite troops, he had fought alone, and just by himself, defeated the Sunlight Scripture, one of the 6 scriptures of the theocracy, and an absolute military force of several dozen men, able to eradicate an elite unit without suffering a single loss of their own. So Gazef, of course, shuddered at the thought of having to fight against him, not only because he personally owned him, a debt of gratitude for saving his life, but also because he could accurately gauge Ainz power and knew that it far surpassed the strength of the kingdom and not just of himself. For this reason, Gazef spoke up and urgently pleaded his king to cede the lands to Ainz. This plea caused astonishment and confusion at court, seeming more like panic than foresight from their own perspective. Because at court they believed that Ainz and his claims were hastily fabricated pretexts for the empire to attack the kingdom once again. Therefore, they did not put much stock in the empire's words regarding Ainz and his claims, considering it just another routine battle that had been happening annually for more than a decade now, and the lethargy and sheer dull force of habit had long since clouded critical thinking, alongside other, more pressing political matters. However, Gazef's words could not be dismissed as unimportant, even though they had the tone of a typical warning. His assessment carried weight. However, the words of the head warrior Gazef could not be dismissed as unimportant, even though they had the tone of just another warning. His assessment carried genuine weight, something the nobles on both sides of the matter were reluctant to admit. As a result, it was proposed to muster many hundreds of men to solely confront and find and combat and neutralize this Ainz. Now, this suggestion in a deeply divided court was almost an incredible compromise and could even be seen as a polite concession to the king. Normally, such a proposal would have been met with mockery and scorn, questioning Gazef's strength and honor, and by extension, the king's very own. Yet, here they at least pretended to take the threat that Ainz posed seriously. Because on the other hand, no one wanted to be the one in the event of a surprising success by the caster that would have underestimated him, and therefore would be personally to blame for this failure. And therefore this gesture also served as a way to protect themselves from any consequences of their own actions, and to not come across as reckless or incompetent or hostile, at least not in the open way. However, even King Ramposa, who sat not only on his throne, but between these factions, was too eager and too focused on the current political climate and the implication it brought to take Gazef's warning seriously. And even if he had fully trusted Gazef's words, Ramposa was still bound by certain political constraints. And this might initially seem strange, as the succession struggle between the royalists, supporting the king's second son Zanek, and the aristocrats backing the crown prince and firstborn Barbro, who was vain and easy to manipulate and therefore a danger to the kingdom, was currently playing out in favor of the king and his faction. The aristocrats had been significantly weakened when Prince Zanek was the one, alongside the king himself, who rode out on the night of the demon emperor Yaldabaoth's invasion of re-estize city to stop him and his army. Meanwhile, the crown prince Barbro had remained inside the palace, which caused the aristocrat faction to be seen as passive and cowardly, while the royalists gained strength and support at court. However, this victory was not decisive enough to declare a clear winner or to break the power of the aristocrats. On the contrary, the powerful noble houses supporting Barbro were now particularly vocal in defying the king and his vassals, offering the greatest possible resistance to secure their position. They acted like cornered rats, who still could fight and bite. And due to these internal political considerations, no side could afford to show weakness or fully address Gazef's warning. The king himself hoped that a victory on the battlefield, this time, would put an end to the annual war, since this time Ramposa was able to mobilize an extraordinary number of soldiers, nearly 250,000 of men, and that they would at least break or severely weaken the legions of the empire. And such a victory could finally put an end to the annual war that drained the kingdom's resources and food supplies through the mobilization effort alone. At the same time, it might also resolve the issue of succession, because ideally a victory against the empire would not only be an external blow to an outside aggressor, potentially destabilizing Jerknev's internal political situation to the point where he would be focused solely on domestic politics for several years in order to stabilize his reign, now that he has this loss on his name that stained his formerly Wild West. But simultaneously, it would also strengthen the king's authority enough to break the coalition of powerful nobles surrounding his firstborn son Barbro, because smaller noble houses as well as the powerful Marquis Raven, who had thus far pretended to be a neutral force, but who secretly supported King Ramposa, but still acted as an impartial mediator, would then be able to openly declare support for the king. And this would demonstrate, without any bloodshed, that the royalists were clearly dominant and that resistance was now futile, now that success of the battlefield had met success at court. And the alternative, once again dictated by internal political considerations affecting the kingdom's foreign policy, was that Ramposa would show weakness by giving up his own personal land to avoid war and to satiate an ever-hungry invader. This would basically politically exile him, and the aristocrats, and especially Barbro, who would fear that the kingdom was now being given away piece by piece, would take this as an opportunity to strike. Such an opportunity might also never come again, and they would be motivated then to start a civil war, plunging the country into chaos, and this in turn could be exploited by the Empire, which, with Ivantel in its possession, could not just strike at Ivantel, but use Ivantel as its base to strike into the heartland of the kingdom itself with full force. Because usually the Empire sent only a few tens of thousands of men against the kingdom's vast armies, which were often 5 to 10 times larger, but significantly worse trained and equipped. So this was a risk that many people noticed but did not even take serious. And this internal conflict again could give the Empire the opportunity to attack with its full might for once, while the kingdom's troops were occupied and divided. However, both sides at court at least had a notion that the Empire was simply waiting for an opportunity, a moment of acute crisis, when the heavily weakened and internally fractured kingdom would be vulnerable, to take the fortress city of Ivantel and then push into the unprotected interior to annex the rich lands onto the Empire. So, they couldn't afford a long war, but a short strike against a weakened king? This would be perhaps in reach for the aristocrat faction. In other words, the intense internal political focus left the entire court, both royalists and aristocrats, so preoccupied with themselves that no one saw the threat posed by Ainz Ulgon. Again, if the kingdom's strongest man, the one who had witnessed Ainz's power firsthand, believed the war was already lost the moment he heard Ainz's name, then under different circumstances, perhaps under the leadership of Zanek or Renner, the nation would have been far more curious and cautious about this sorcerer. And they could have mobilized their espionage network to gather more information. They could have consulted the magic guilds for advice and for additional forces to counter Ainz. And at the very least, they could have briefed their troops on Ainz's capabilities, as learned by Gazef, and devised a plan to address the immense risk posed by these abilities of Ainz, which Gazef knew well. A man who could control a Death Knight through his mask alone, and who had single-handedly wiped out one of the scriptures of the theocracy, should have been a massive red flag in terms of the battlefield, even if Ainz had only been the human sorcerer capable of controlling a single Death Knight as he appeared to be. The army of the kingdom would have walked into an undead battlefield. One a certain sorcerer might be potentially in charge of, and again, the only thing that the kingdom's army, the royal army, had going for it was their sheer numbers. But if a certain sorcerer, allied with the Empire of Barut, could raise the dead on the battlefield, the numbers of the kingdom could be turned against them. And yet no one even considered this. Neither side could afford to show this weakness, and thus the royal army would have been marched blindly to its doom, Even if Ainz had been merely a member of Zurnon or the Corpus of the Abyss, and not the undead overlord of Nazarick that he is, he still would have posed an immense threat that yet hadn't been adequately addressed. As a result, the royal army would have still charged headlong into disaster. And this also relates to the position of Gazef Stronov. Though he had witnessed Ainz controlling a powerful undead, and had been rescued by Ainz from the Sunlight Scripture, his words carried little weight at court, all things considered, and the reason why Gazef was not a knight or noble, but rather a armed commoner, the reason why he was merely the commander of the royal warriors, the king's head warrior, and not a knight or captain, was that both sides of the succession struggle, the aristocrats and the royalists, saw his rise from humble origins as a threat to their own position. They were determined not to create a precedent where a farmer's son could receive a noble title purely based on merit, and then stay at court, because such a precedent would eventually lead to the emergence of a new noble class, comprised of highly competent warriors, casters, administrators, and merchants, loyal to the king. And these new nobles could then become formidable rivals, ultimately threatening the position of any old nobility, be them aristocrats or royalists. And if it had been Marquis Raven, a seemingly neutral and powerful aristocrat at court who had witnessed Ainz's power, the warning could not so easily be dismissed. But even then, neither side could afford to show weakness before this very important war, nor could they justify the surrender of territory, fearing such weakness would be exploited. In other words, the internal political situation led to a tunnel vision in this foreign policy, and a naive self-absorption that in retrospective cost the life of nearly 200,000 people and weakened the kingdom in the long term. And among the many options the kingdom could have taken were direct negotiations with Ainz, the surrender of royal land in exchange for his services, so Ainz would get the lands, in exchange for an alliance with the kingdom without having to actually fight, approaching the theocracy whose Sunlight Scripture had been annihilated by this necromancer, or turning to Arkland, where Platinum Dragonlord, who was at least in the Corpus of the Abyss, feared as a potential deadly opponent, could have been approached. Or the kingdom could have enlisted noble adventurers like Lacius or her uncle Azud Ainra for their own cause. Not as adventurers, of course, but as nobles fulfilling the obligation to king and country. But all these possibilities fell victim to internal political chaos and the tunnel vision that caused in foreign policy. Of course, none of these measures would have likely changed the outcome of the Battle of the Cuts Plain, especially not in such a short time. But that they didn't try show the internal weakness and dividedness of this very kingdom, and the poor reaction to this very, very important change in the declaration of the war also meant that they were weak, not just as an economy, but also as a nation. And with that said, now it's your turn. What do you think about the reaction of the kingdom and how embroiled they were in the internal politics? Let me know it down in the comment section. And with that said, please check out my German channel, my fantasy channel, and if you don't want to listen to my voice or accent, but are still interested in the things I have to say, I have made an AI channel where I use AI voice covers for my videos, so please check it out as well. And the channels I mentioned are linked down in the video description. Also, please check out my Patreon if you want to support me beyond just leaving a like or sub. And with that said, thank you very much for watching. Thanks to my Patreons for supporting this channel, and special thanks to Ada Daddy Ada, ASK, Bad Guy Ye, Bad Burrito 316, Bezer, Ben C, Brandon D, Chrissy, Crowley 0221, Sia, Crystal Prime, Dead Slime, Death is Mercy, Deathless Dragonlord, Demon Xenomorph 1987, Devin Downen, Ding Dong, Dan Pep, Dragonlord Placido Saxophone, Duckwagon, Dunkler Krieger, Dystopia, Dystopia II, Enigmatic Unicorn, Feralchivan, Guy with That Head, Hector Moreno, Hoss, Huster, Jacob G, Jana B, Jason, J. Morris, Chromius, Kyle R, Lee K. Long, Legendarius, Lelouch V. Britannia with a Mustache, Lexus Fox, Lord Nishikian Rai, Lord Touch Me, Loverazer, Merovec, Mr. Shoes, Mr. Tweaker, Michael R, Michael Y, Nope, Oh Hell No, Normal Toad, O'Kill, Overlord General Gasper, Paddy Pantum, Personage, Ruru, Primus 11, Rhinomere, Cune Caracos P, Shergox's Daddy, Shadow Lightning Wolf, Shrine Keeper, Sir Axolotl, Super Tier Magic Batista Bomb, Supreme Cheese, Staris, Ted, Texas Deer, Diorg Warboss, Rock Ed Smasher, T.E. Wang, Vash Hawkeye, Vegito 27, Venture Fanatic, Wilhelm, Zinukai, and Sonagon. Thanks guys. Anyway, have a nice day, and I hope to see you all again soon under my next video.